Welcome back to Talks and Takes. This is a special episode where myself will be introducing Darcy Delsonno, a special education teacher at Talmadge High School. We will be going over education philosophies, constructivism, behaviorism, and cognitism. All right, welcome to the podcast, Ms. Delsonno. Would you like to give a little background into your career in addition to you as an intervention specialist here at Talmadge High School?
Sure. I started working here at Talmadge High School in 2006. I first started as a long-term sub as a math teacher because that was my first degree. And then when I didn't find a job, I kept long-term subbing here, and I started subbing as an intervention specialist, and I really enjoyed the job. So I ended up going back and getting my master's degree in special education, and I have worked here as an intervention specialist ever since.
Sounds like a long, fun career.
So far, so good.
So, before we get started on the main topic of today's interviews, have you heard of education philosophies?
Of course.
Do you have a favorite enlightenment thinker?
Well, I use them all, but I would say those questions you have here about behaviorism is really important for special education teachers. I took 2 classes in college on applied behavior analysis that really impact how I do things and how I collect data and give positive reinforcements in the classroom.
All right. Well, we know your favorite then. So, leading into behaviorism, how do you like to apply reinforcement when supporting students with exceptionalities?
First of all, praise for anytime they're doing something positive. So I'm constantly walking around the classroom looking for things to compliment, the ways to support the students when they're doing things successfully to try and reinforce that. Then big picture, as I look at number 2, when you're looking at changing desired behaviors, you have to collect some data and figure out what we need to change first, and that's what I like to do is collect data. And then once you get a goal of what you would like to see, it's really easy to reinforce that with positive behaviors, and things like candy go above praise, but also earning things. So if you have a goal in mind, like you would like that student to turn in their work every week, or you would like them to talk less in class, whatever that goal is, if you give them ways to reach that goal in tiny ways in little increments and then reward them as they get there and give them a big reward once they get to the final goal, it really does change behavior. And I've seen it work a lot, even though not every teacher believes me. It takes a lot of time to change behavior. It doesn't work instantly. So I think that's why sometimes people are discouraged by it, because it's a lot of work to change behavior.
So, leading on to that, when you say not all teachers believe you right away, do you think there's a time you give too much to a student? Or do you think you know, like, the range that you can offer a student?
I'm definitely always worried about that. And I think Ms. Bowser, as my co-teacher, sometimes she can check me in that and say, is that actually helping the student, or are you hindering them? And so she gives me good perspective on that. But I think as my career's gone on, I've gotten better at just knowing what is too much. Where when I first started out, I just wanted to help everyone so much, and I wanted everyone to get everything done, that I wasn't realizing how much I was doing and how that doesn't actually help students. So now in year 19, it's a lot easier to distinguish between what actually helps a student and what is doing too much and is actually hindering.
So, what role does data collection play in monitoring student behavior and progress? I assume you use the candy as kind of like a ground point. You monitor where they start from and how they improve. But how does data collection play further in the day-to-day?
Okay, so if I have a student that has some behavior that really needs to change, the very first thing I need to do is collect baseline data. So if you're getting in trouble, I want to know, how often are you getting in trouble? Are you being written up several times a week? What is that number? And then what is a good goal that I can reduce it to? So if you're getting written up every day in every block, then I'm not going to set a goal for you to get no write-ups. That's not realistic. We have to figure out where that student is right now and then come up with a goal that's attainable. Because if you set your goal too high, everybody's going to get frustrated and we're not going to get anywhere. So you have to collect data first to see where the kid is, and then use that data to see if you are making improvements. Because sometimes you implement a plan, and if you don't collect the data to see whether that plan is working, you could just keep pushing through that plan and never realize that that plan isn't actually making any improvement for anyone. Sometimes it's just a thought. And not every plan I've determined works. So sometimes I come up with a plan, and after 2 weeks I go, oh my God, that is not helping at all. And we need to come back and have a meeting with other people involved and come up with a new plan. But if you're not collecting data, you might not know that your plan's not working.
All right. So a few minutes ago, you mentioned Miss Bowser. I know she's a very important part of your day-to-day life as a teacher, but what are some ways you collaborate with her and other general education teachers to ensure consistent reinforcement and consequences across classroom settings?
Okay, so if I was going to come up with a behavior plan, first thing I would do is talk about it with my co-teacher so that if I'm collecting data, she knows exactly what data I'm collecting and she's helping me collect it. Because if I'm on the other side of the room and that student is calling out or needing help or whatever we're collecting, I need her to be part of that data collection process too. Sometimes it's easier to collect data in one setting, but most of the time you need students to apply these skills in multiple settings, so you want to work with the other teachers and get them on board. So if the behavior I'm trying to change has something to do with how they behave in all classes, I want all 4 teachers collecting data. So I have some students that will take their own data collection sheets to their teachers. At the end of the week, they check in and they say, how would you rate my behavior? How would I rate it? And they compare, have that conversation so that we're not just collecting the data, but also reflecting on it, sharing it with the students so that they can see either their progress or lack of progress, depending on what the data is showing. But it's important to not only to reflect on it as teachers, but to also have the students participate in that reflection too. And without your co-teacher involved, you're not going to have accurate data. Without the other teachers in the building involved, we're only going to get a small piece of the picture. And if I only know what's happening in your math class, then I'm not able to help you all day.
All right, and that was our behaviorism questions. How do you feel so far? Am I stressing you out?
No,
You enjoying
I
it?
like to talk about behaviorism.
So next we're going to talk a little bit about constructivism. Do you have a piece of constructivism you favorite most when using?
I always like to start. This was something I got from Ms. Conway. When we start a new unit, try to have a hook or something that gets the students interested and connects to the previous learning. So she was really good when I co-taught with her about when we start a new unit, we'll watch a clip or something that connects the new information to what they've already learned and where we're going with it. I think that's something I could improve on. I'm really good with the behavior stuff. This is something I need to improve on.
Good. All right. So, first question on constructivism. What strategies do you use to help students make connections between new information and their prior knowledge or experience?
Well, in math, the content is always related to the previous content. So the last unit is always going to connect to the new unit. But it's also important to connect it to life experiences. So if we're doing probability, we want to talk about where would you see that in the news or what you might read about. Or if it's statistical reasoning, we want to talk about how you might use that in your career field or things like that. So it's important to get to know your students, to know what they're interested in so you can try to make those connections. Because I could connect the math to the previous math, but that doesn't interest people. It's important, but it's not going to be a hook to get the kids invested in learning, and that's why what I was saying with Ms. Conway's strategy, she always has that hook to get you interested.
And is that hook and those connections the main way you encourage students to take an active role in their education?
Absolutely.
All right. How do you promote critical thinking and problem-solving skills among students? I assume it's easier with math than, say, English or...
Absolutely. But it is really hard to get students to try to do those things on their own. You can show them example problems and ask them to apply it. And if you're applying it to similar problems, no big deal. It's that jump when you say apply it to something different than what I've showed you that is really hard. And that's hard for all students, especially students with disabilities. So it takes a lot of scaffolding to get there. Ms. Bowser and I went to some trainings over the last couple years about having more depth of knowledge questions on our tests, and we actually rewrote all of our assessments over the last like 5 years to try and ask harder questions that were more critical thinking instead of just testing them on math facts. So its application is way more important. And if you look at the state test, which since I teach Algebra 1 every year in the 19 years I've taught here, that Algebra 1 state test is important for students to graduate. And a lot of the problems on there are application problems. So it's not enough to be able to solve an equation. You have to be able to apply that to a real world situation.
All right. So you talked a little bit about scaffolding instruction. How do you determine the right level of support or guidance to provide without taking away from the student's independence in learning?
Okay, that's a great question, and it is really hard to do, and you have to adjust constantly. So it takes a lot of flexibility and being creative. I think Bowser and I like to come up with different versions of things that we might scaffold because we've seen other students struggle with it in the past. Having taught for 19 years, I've got prior knowledge of what seems to be hard for students in the past. So sometimes based on that, I'll scaffold things or present it a little bit differently to students. But I'm always making multiple versions so that if there's one student in the room that doesn't need that support, they're getting the paper without that support. And if there's 10 kids in the room that need extra support and labels and visual models for them, then they're getting that. And usually I start with one or two versions, and then as the years go on, I'll say, you know what, there's a group of kids in between that need just a little bit of support, but not as much as the other ones, and they can't start from scratch like the other ones. So I end up finding levels, and this was actually a question with my my formal evaluation from Mr. Horner recently, and he asked the same question. How do you determine who gets what level? And it's really just working one-on-one with the students, getting to know them personally, watching the students do their work every day so you know who's struggling and who's not. And then my co-teacher and I, Ms. Bowser, have a conversation about it, but that doesn't mean that some kids might not move. Like sometimes I'll give you a paper and I'll say, you know what, you need more help than that, or you know what, this is too easy for you, and I'll switch you to the other level. So it's a constant moving thing. So it takes a lot of reevaluation and a lot of flexibility to say, you know what, this isn't working, we're going to switch to something else, or I need to add something. This didn't go well. Next year when I teach it, it's going to need some more support in it.
Gotcha. I do like how it's both equal and equitable education, not just one or the other.
Yes. And it does take a lot of work to do that. So I'm very blessed to have a co-teacher that's willing to put in the extra hours and create these things with me and reflect on it. And if it doesn't go well, fix it for next year. And I'm very blessed.
Miss Bowser's going to blush during this podcast. She's going to be like, oh, she said such nice things about me.
Well, she should know she's wonderful.
Yes, she is. All right, and now probably one of my favorite parts of teaching philosophies, just because I like thinking about the brain and like very minute details, is cognitism. How do you help students organize and process new information effectively?
I like to use visuals for math, so a lot of flowcharts and graphic organizers that help them organize like solving processes. So anytime things are multi-step, I like to give students a list of steps that they can reference. Sometimes it helps to give them models as well. Sometimes I combine those two things. So maybe on the left-hand side, there's a list of steps, and on the right-hand side, there's a model that goes with it that shows what those steps look like. But I do know that not everyone processes information the same way. So just because that visual model works for me, that's where I always start. But I'm always trying to get to know my students to find other ways that might work for them. So some students see things visually, some never see it visually and just need those steps. And you really have to get to know your students and see which methods work best for each kid individually.
What strategies, when working with these methods or other aspects, what strategies do you use or activate prior knowledge before introducing new content?
So this was also something Ms. Bowser and I got from Ms. Conway, the educator of all educators that I learned so much from. It's called Drip, Drip, Splash. And that's a way to introduce things like weeks before. So we do review activities at the start of class every single day. You remember them as math meters. And those math meters are very intentional. So if we're going to teach systems of equations, we're going to start doing the necessary pieces for that several weeks before that in the review math meters. So we're going to introduce it with a sprinkle, and then we're going to sprinkle it a little more, and then you'll get a splash, and then finally you'll learn it. So before we actually learn the big topic, you've learned the parts and pieces, or at least reviewed them. Maybe you learned them in 6th grade or 7th grade. You haven't done it in a while. So we make sure that we take class time to review it in a different situation. So once we get to that new topic, if it's multiple layers, the students are prepared for that.
All right. And then how do you develop students or support students in developing problem solving and critical thinking skills?
Very hard, especially because I teach mostly freshmen. But when I'm giving all of this support, if I'm giving you a model, if I'm doing the problems with you on a review the first day, as soon as a student puts their hand in the air, I'm going to ask them those questions. Have you looked at my examples? Have you pulled out your model? Are you looking at what you have and trying to apply it? And if they are doing all of those things and they still need help, I am happy to help them. But my first question is always, have you tried to solve this on your own before you just put your hand in the air because it was difficult? So that would be my biggest push, is have you tried it on your own first? The other thing I would say I'm getting better at as I get further in my career is if a kid needs help, just circling things and asking them to look to find their mistakes instead of pointing out their mistakes to them, which is something I did earlier in my career. I'd say, oh, well, you dropped your negative here or something like that. Now I say, look back at your work where you distributed. See if you can find your mistake, because I think that helps students develop those skills a lot better than if I just point out things to them.
And then going back to scaffolding instruction again, what ways do you use it to match the cognitive abilities and learning needs of your students?
So some students will come to you with an IEP, and there'll be a detailed list of what accommodations they need and why they need those accommodations based on the assessments that were done by the school psychologist. But also some students will come to you that just struggle and they don't have any of that information. We don't have a plan for them. They haven't been identified, but they still need support. So those are the types of students that I'll try, hey, maybe I'll give them a scaffolded thing that I was using for another student with a disability and see if that helps. Because just because a student isn't identified with a disability doesn't mean that they couldn't benefit from an accommodation or a type of scaffolding that helps them access the same curriculum. As long as when we get to the end of the unit, they can be assessed and do everything independently, I don't mind giving you steps along the way to get to the end goal.
And then I know we've kind of sprinkled this in and touched on it throughout the questions, but how do you monitor and adjust your own teaching when a student struggles to process or retain the information?
So we definitely assess every single day. So a big part of what Ms. Bowser and I do is we walk around and check student work every single day. So every day, every student will have something that they've done independently checked. So we know at the end of each class who's struggling and who's got it. So immediate feedback that way. But then also when we give an assessment or even a graded assignment in class, even if it's not a test, if anybody doesn't do well on it, they are absolutely required to correct it. If they get that done in class, awesome. If they need extra time in academy, then we make that available. Because if students aren't understanding something, they need it to go on to the next unit. So we can't just go, oh, well, they failed that unit and keep moving forward. Everything has to be retaught and reassessed. So we're looking at assessment scores, but each day we're checking every kid in the room to get an idea of who needs help before we even assess. Because if I know for 4 days in a row you struggle with that problem, I'm going to pull you in before the test, not wait for you to fail the test.
Gotcha. And then it looks like we just wrapped up all the questions. Is there anything else you would like our listeners to know about teaching philosophies or special education that you might not get to see on the day-to-day from the outside?
I would say most important thing for working with students with special needs is to be flexible And just because it's not written in an IEP doesn't mean you can't come up with a way to service that student or to help them access the curriculum. So be creative, be willing to work with other people, and be flexible, because it might not always look like you'd imagine it would look. But if the student can get to learning and get to show you what they've learned at the end of it, then it's a success.
All right. Thank you for joining me today, Ms. Delsonno. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast in this special episode of Teaching Philosophies in Special Education.
Thank you, Sky. I look forward to hearing your philosophies after you become a teacher and how things change.
We'll see what my favorite becomes. I know you love your behaviorism.
You'll like it too.